We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
G'day Space Junkies, welcome back to Space Junk Podcast, the co-video edition. And today I'm speaking with Dr. Brian Weeden and Victoria Samson from the Secure World Foundation over in the US. Victoria, Brian, it is a pleasure to talk to you. How are you today?
Thanks for having us on here. Really glad to be here. How are you doing?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. We've still got adequate supplies of toilet paper, and while the pasta is running low, we're not yet starving. So I think we're doing really well on world standards. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, we're doing okay. We're, getting by, I guess. Still got lots of cookies and brownies and stuff we're baking every day with the kids. So, just to keep the spirits up.
That sounds fantastic. I mean, if you're going to have kids, you want them to be baking good things for you, right? So I wanted to start by asking a few questions about the Secure World Foundation as an entity. People watching this or listening may not have heard of it, although if you do anything with space, you probably have. But I'm not sure who'd like to go, and feel free to jump over the top of each other and make it really awkward. But I wanted to ask, first off, sort of what is the Secure World Foundation? What's its purpose? Why does it exist?
Well, Brian and I have worked together for 11 years, so we have zero problem talking over each other. We're very good at it. And Brian, stop me at any point. The Secure World Foundation is a private organization that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. As we push for best practices, norms of behavior to make sure that space is usable and accessible for all over the long term. So we have a kind of a global, international, cooperative approach to making sure that space is sustainable for all, in a nutshell.
Yeah, to add into that, when we define space sustainability, our focus is how can we continue to use space for all the great benefits it currently provides and all the ones we haven't even yet dreamed of across commercial, scientific, civil, pretty much everything, national security. And so we look at it both in terms of, we have projects that look at sustaining the space environment. So we look at space debris and space situation awareness, but then we also have projects focused on how we use space for benefits on Earth. Things like sustainable development, dealing with natural disasters, climate change, and all that sort of fun stuff as well.
Right. And the title, Secure World, do we know where that came from?
Well, as best we can figure, that was a decision made by our founder, Cinda Collins-Arsenault, back around 2006 or so. It was before either of us. It was before either of us joined. So we're not quite sure exactly. But so the vast majority of our money comes from a couple in Colorado. They have several philanthropic efforts. Secure World Foundation is one of those. In general, they want to make the world a better place. And so that was how they came up with the name. And sort of the space sustainability focused mission came later. So yeah, there's not really a strong correlation between the name and the mission. We sort of had the name and the foundation, and then they came across this gap in anyone working on space sustainability. And we've been doing that for just about the last 10 years or so. Fantastic.
Now, Victoria, I'd like to come back to you and ask how it is that you came to work in the world of space.
I'm kind of an anomaly for people who work on space policy, and I feel a little guilty about that because I know a lot of people work on space. They grew up dreaming about going to space. They went to astronaut camp. They get up early and see launches, and think about if I had the money, I'd go into space. None of that. I have nightmares about going into space, actually. I got into space from the security aspects. My first job out of grad school was working for a defense contractor on missile defense working scenarios. Missile defense, where you basically try to hit a missile with another missile. It's like shooting down a bullet with another bullet. So I did that for a couple years, and then I switched sides to the light side and worked for arms control groups. And focused mostly on nukes, missiles, chemical, biological weapons, that sort of thing. And then I went to work for a think tank that was a progressive military think tank. And as part of that, I worked on missile defense nukes, but that was during the Bush 43 administration, the George W. Bush administration, when they were looking at possibly renewing space-based interceptor programs. And so that my space work came out of my missile defense work. And then when Secure World wanted to solidify their DC presence, I applied for the job and got there and been there 11 years. And I really enjoyed the space policy work.
That is an interesting path, and I think it's good for people to know that not everyone grows up kind of dreaming of space and then works in the field. Like I'm one of those people who didn't really think about space that much until I thought, oh, that's an interesting area of international governance. Maybe I'll have a look at that. And then, you know, once you're in and you kind of hooked on it. But until that point, I think, I don't know, I feel kind of the same. So I do think that it's important for people to know that not everyone is that cookie cutter, like space obsessed kid that comes through. I mean, my family, that was my brother.
Right. You know, we actually had an event a couple years ago called It's Not Just Rocket Science, with the idea that the space community, there's so many jobs involved. As you said, there's legal jobs, there's commercial jobs, there's government affairs, there's journalist jobs, and of course, scientists and engineers. I mean, it takes a lot of people to get things going in space. And, you know, then you have people like Brian who are more traditional in their space interests.
Right. And Brian, I'm going to pick on you now and ask you to describe your more traditional space interests and how you came to form them.
Well, you know, actually, like Victoria, I was never, a space, dreaming of space when I was growing up as a kid. My background, I studied engineering in college. I went into the U.S. Air Force, and I worked in space and missile operations career field. And one of the jobs I had there was the time the Air Force squadron that tracked all the stuff in orbit, all the space junk and all the satellites, and you know, did a whole bunch of things as a result of that. That was what really got me into space, was doing that job. And then I left the military, and via International Space University, I found out about Secure World Foundation. They hired me as a contractor to do basically technical work on space debris and space situation awareness. And 11 years later, I'm still here.
Now, today I wanted to focus on your Counterspace report that came out very recently. And this is a report that I guess you guys put out relatively regularly. And it kind of goes through, if anyone's watching this and hasn't looked at one, just go and Google it. Secure World Foundation Counterspace report. There's a couple of years worth on the internet. And it kind of does a really neat summary of who's doing what when it comes to space. I don't want to say weapons, but it's probably weapons. And I wanted to ask, as the first question, kind of why this report came to be. What's the purpose of it, and who's the audience?
So I guess I'll get started. We've been doing the report for 3 years now, and the original purpose of it was to put something out in the public that allowed us to have a more public and a more open discussion about what we saw as the proliferation of counterspace capabilities. Now, what does that word mean? A counterspace is sort of what its easy definition is, something that goes against space. It's a category of military capabilities that are used to counteract space capabilities. Everything from destroying satellites via physical means to jamming or cyber attacks. So what the report does is looks at what is going on across several different categories of these different counterfeit technologies and in many countries across the world. And we draw on all these different open sources, whether they're official reports or news reports or tracking data, all sorts of different things. And we try to synthesize through all those different reports to figure out what is going on, who's working on what, and sort of what is the purpose of it. Are they trying to do just testing, or are they just experimenting, or are they actually trying to develop something operationally useful? And again, the intent of it is so that we can know more about what's going on and then have a conversation about what to do about it.
Right. Yeah, just because so much when you talk about space issues, it gets classified so quickly. It's really hard, especially about the security type stuff. And so it's so hard to have a thorough policy discussion. because either it's just hyperbolic, the sky is falling, for the US perspective. Oh my gosh, the Russian and Chinese, they're coming at us with their space capabilities, or it just gets very, kind of mum's a word. If you only knew what we know, but we can't really do anything about it. So you just need to give us more money and, programs to work on it. Trust us, we know what we're doing. And that's not really a healthy way to have the discussion. And so what we really wanted to do was contextualize what's happening. What do we actually know about these programs? What don't we know? And, if a lot of times when you hear about these programs, there's an automatic assumption that this capability is meant to be used malevolently. And a lot of the programs we identify say, okay, it could be used for this type of weapon system, or it could be used as on-orbit servicing or something that's meant to help out their satellite systems. We don't know. And so for us, we really wanted to try and identify what we actually don't know and what we don't know. And one of the other things that we really wanted to make sure we included in this conversation was that it was not just adversaries in the United States. We include the United States in this counterspace threat assessment, because we felt it was important to say, okay, if you're worried about what's happening, again, looking at the U.S. National Security Community, if you're worried about what's happening with China's and Russia's counterspace capabilities, here is what we actually can do. And most of the time, we have very similar capabilities. Things we're concerned about them doing, we do ourselves. And again, not saying that's okay for anyone, but just saying, look, this is not just they're doing bad things and we're doing good things, or we're doing bad things and they're doing good things. One affects the other. And we also have included more traditional U.S. partners, like in India in the past. And this year, for the first year, we included France and Japan because they've made some statements indicating interest in offensive counterspace capabilities.
And Victoria, when it comes to doing that research, you said it's important to have, I guess, an unclassified resource so that the conversation can occur. But I'm imagining then that there's quite a significant job there to do that research and assemble all that information that is unclassified into a single report. That would take a long time. That would be very hard work, I imagine.
It was. For the first year that we did it, we hired some outside experts to help kind of build the building blocks, the base for this analysis. And then in recent years, as the year goes through, we mark news stories that we want to use to update, and we update them ourselves. But we felt it was very important. I mean, I don't have a clearance. Brian doesn't have a clearance. It's meant to be used as an open source assessment. And it's amazing what you can find. If you can put all this information you can see in the open source arena, if you can put it all in one place, it can actually be very helpful.
Yeah, I think once you kind of know a bit about it, it's much easier to put the puzzle pieces together. And that's just having the background knowledge as well. But I think it's a really useful source. And I think that the dashboards in particular, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, again, go and look it up. There's these sort of traffic light dashboards showing who's doing what and who has what capability or is developing that capability. And it's just a very easy kind of snapshot way of comparing everything. And as you say, that's very helpful when you're trying to have a sensible discussion about capability. But my sort of big question is, over the 3 years that you've done this now, what's changed? What have you noticed has shifted? Have things remained relatively stable, or are things moving around?
Well, so we went into this project and, we knew that there was some stuff going on in the US. We knew Russia and China were working on some stuff. We didn't really think there's much going on outside of that. And as Victoria mentioned, over the 3 years, we've added several more countries, because it turns out there's actually a lot of countries that are thinking about military activities in space and having to protect their own capabilities while possibly having to interdict somebody else's capabilities. So we had this notion that this area of technology was proliferating, but what we've seen over the last 3 years is, yeah, it really is. And there are multiple countries that have some serious development programs. And by that, I mean, we're seeing programs that stretch over several years to a decade or more, with multiple flight tests. And they're sort of staged developmental flight tests, where they test a little bit of it and then they test a little bit more and test a little bit more. Exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to see from a military aircraft or a tank or or something where they're building something they plan to use operationally. So I think that's the biggest thing for me that I've seen, is that it's not just a couple of countries, it's at least a half dozen and growing. And then, so that's sort of a not so good news out of it. I think the one good news piece of it that we've seen is, while there's a lot of interest and some testing of what we call kinetic or the actual physically destructive capabilities, the stuff we actually see being used in conflicts around the world right now is all the non-destructive stuff. Things like jamming, cyber attacks, various types of electronic warfare. That's being used in Syria, it's being used in Ukraine, it's being used in other places. So for now, at least, there still is this norm or stigma against doing a destructive attack against somebody else's satellite. Hopefully that stays that way. But one of our concerns is that it may not.
Right. I think for me, in addition to what Brian mentioned, over the past couple of years, it seems that it's almost becoming a matter of national prestige. If you want to be a great space power, it's not enough to launch your own satellites. It's not enough to have the ability to put a probe near the moon. Now you have to have a counter space program. It seems like that's where we're evolving to, which is a little disconcerting, because the more counter space programs there are out there, there's a better chance that at some point there's going to be some misunderstanding or miscomprehension, and things could escalate unintentionally, or who knows, maybe even intentionally. So I think for me, over the past couple of years, we've seen that. The first year we did it, we included India, and India had not actually tested an ASAT at that point, but we thought they actually might. And sure enough, the second year, we sent the Counterspace doc to the publishers. And literally that next day, we woke up and India had an ASAT test, and we had to call them and say, stop the presses. We have to update this very quickly. And so that was a big change. The other thing, though, that I think has been interesting for me in working on this project is that some of the more traditional, I guess, that we think of as traditional adversaries for the U.S. and the West, they're not quite as threatening as I think you might plan on. You look at, for example, North Korea. You say, okay, what exactly do we know about their counter space capabilities? Have they ever said anything about it? Have they ever tested these type of programs? Do they have any kind of SSA, space situational awareness tracking capabilities? Not really. The same thing with Iran, who is listed very often as, hey, they're doing these sort of things. They haven't launched a satellite successfully in years. They barely have a space situational awareness network, if that. There's rumors they might have a couple telescopes. And so again, not to downplay that there's potential for the threat, but when you're trying to say, okay, if we're trying to actively look at the domain that we're dealing with, and not one that we just are being lazy and saying, well, if we're traditionally your U.S. adversary in the nuclear arena, you're going to be an adversary in the space arena, it doesn't always translate.
Right, and I think it's an interesting question around the effect of information sharing. So I think that historically, when it comes to space activities, a lot of things, as you say, have been classified pretty quickly, and there's a lack of information more broadly, which in some ways you could say, keeps things cool, reduces the risk of people finding out about stuff, getting upset and going to war. But on the other hand, and I think it's a much more compelling argument, when there isn't information sharing in a more public sense, it allows governments or policymakers to kind of tell the story that they want to tell at the time they want to tell it. And so in that sense, I think that the effect of these sorts of reports, in, as you say, pointing out, where something isn't as sinister as you might think it is probably also very useful. Is that something you think about?
Yeah, and we actually see quite a bit of that going on. So when we look at, how this is talked about in the media in the U.S. and in Congress and by politicians, it's a very, is saying, doom and gloom, oh my gosh, look at all these bad things everybody else is doing. We're so far behind, which is not really the case. And there's been several instances where, something was attributed that China did this, like China, grappled a satellite with a robotic arm and pulled it out of orbit. Turns out that didn't happen. But it was a couple of stories that said it happened, and everybody kind of repeated all those stories, and so everybody thinks it happened. So yeah, one of the reasons we're trying to do this is to, again, have a more informed conversation. And of course, it happens elsewhere as well, right? You should see what they write in the Russian and Chinese press about the X-37B. It's, this killer anti-satellite weapon that can do everything, that's going to, dominate the world, which of course it's not. But it's not just it's not just the U.S. It's every country sort of has this tendency to look at things through their own domestic lens, interpret it through their own domestic politics, and also sort of say, well, they're doing that because they're trying to do something against me, which of course may not be the case. It may be somebody else.
With the classification of space issues, it's interesting because there's an interest in developing sort of counter space capabilities, and oftentimes the argument is, well, it serves as a deterrent, right? Other countries will interfere with our space assets that they know we're going to be able to, respond. But then the programs are so heavily classified. How is that a deterrent? We don't even know what it does or what it can do. How is it going to scare anyone off? On a more benign level, the idea of transparency in space is really important. There's almost a knee-jerk classification that goes on that might have been helpful a couple decades ago, but now when you have anyone with their telescope in the backyard can see something being launched, I mean, sure, you don't need to actually identify what the satellites are, their plans and goals and that sort of thing, but their mere existence of these space capabilities, other people can see them. They're not hidden. And so when you're classifying them to that extent, all you're doing is limiting your ability to talk about them, and you're not really getting any kind of security benefit from doing so. But that's an old habit that's dying very hard. It's interesting because you hear U.S. military officials talk about, we want to get some of this overclassification taken away, and even they're having a hard time getting rid of that instinct to instantly classify everything. So it's a thing in process, that's for sure.
Right. It also affects America's allies as well. I know that in Australia that, we kind of have to toe the line a lot. And if the US wants something to be very classified, then it is very classified in all of the countries that the US has partnerships as well. So I suppose in some ways, it's not outrageous to say, I think everyone would say so, but in this sense as well, the US casts a very long shadow, and the policies that are developed there will affect everybody in kind of a magnified sense.
And it has, so important is it has implications. You talk to people in the U.S. military that have served with their coalition partners, Australia and others that are active in, let's say, Afghanistan for the last almost 20 years. There are huge problems that have been arising through this overclassification, particularly on space data like satellite imagery, and the inability to share it, even among the close allies, when they're trying to work together in a military situation. So it's not just a political inconvenience, but it can actually have real problems when it comes to trying to cooperate together.
Now, I want to get on to some concrete examples of counter space activities. And Victoria, I'm going to come to you on anti-satellite testing. But before I do, just very rapidly, Brian, what is a directed energy weapon? Because it sounds fascinating, but I think that a lot of my listeners and watchers won't have heard that much about it.
So, in its simplest form, directed energy weapon is a laser. It's a category of weapons where you are taking really powerful beams of energy and you are focusing them in a way, in what they call a coherent manner, that then can have some effects. So lasers is like the thing most people know about that, because a laser is a coherent, focused part of light. There are other things in there. There are particle beams and other sorts of even things like masers and all sorts of cool stuff. But in general, it's just think lasers. And in the case of counterspace capabilities, they have possibly a range of effects. So on the low end, a relatively low power laser, in fact, a really low power laser is really useful for tracking a satellite. You fire the laser out, it reflects off the satellite, it comes back, and you can measure the distance to the satellite really accurately. Do that a few times, and you kind of have a really good idea where it is. And that is actually done commercially around the world to kind of keep track of where satellites are in the geostationary belt. You add even more power to it, though, and now you get a laser that if it hits something that has a camera on it, it has an effect we call dazzling. And by that, you can think of it as shining like a bright flashlight in somebody's eyes, where it kind of temporarily clouds their vision, maybe even blinds them a little temporarily. That's what dazzling does. And so you can think about, if you're concerned about somebody flying a satellite overhead and taking pictures of, let's say, your military base, or a deployment of troops you have somewhere around the world, if you can dazzle that satellite while it's overhead, they can't take the picture. That could be useful capability. Keep going, and you can go from just dazzling to actually permanently doing damage to the sensors and the optics on a satellite. And that's sort of the state of the art where we are right now. Beyond that, of course, is the some people talk about the ability to physically damage a satellite with a laser, like burn a hole through it, or something on those lines. That's really hard to do from the ground up into space. But of course, there are people working on it. And the technology for that is getting better. But right now, when we talk about counterfeit capabilities, a lot of the direct energy stuff is in the dazzling, temporarily blinding category.
Sure. How powerful are we talking with these lasers? How powerful does a laser need to be to dazzle something?
It really depends on a lot of different factors. Depends on sort of the wavelength. That depends upon whether protective measures. But I would say you probably say kilowatt class is probably could probably dazzle. Then once you start getting into the megawatt class and higher, then you're talking probably more into the permanent effects category.
Sure. That is very useful. Thank you. Now, Victoria, ASATs, because you are the person to talk to about missiles and so forth. As we're recording this, in the last 12 to 24 hours, Russia conducted an ASAT test of their noodle. I think that's how you say it. And more recently in the history, we've had some other ASAT tests. So what should we be thinking about this? What should we know about this?
Right. I mean, during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union both had a series of anti-satellite tests. And we both kind of independently decided that they were so destabilizing, it'd be better off if we stopped doing it. So that really ended around the time of the Cold War. The United States had one in 1985 as an air-launched missile against a satellite. And then there was nothing until 2007, when the Chinese tested a ground-launched anti-satellite weapon against one of their aging weather satellites. It was at a high enough altitude that created a large amount of debris, which is still up there being tracked, in a very crowded orbit. And then shockingly in 2008, the United States said, oh, hey, we've got this satellite that's not really working, never really started supposed to do, it's going to be a danger, we better shoot it down. And so we swapped out the software, one of our missile defense interceptors, one of our seed-based interceptors, and made it an anti-satellite weapon and shot down the satellite with that. And then there was nothing for a while. And then in 2019, as we said, the Indians did a ground launch anti-satellite test against one of their satellites. And then, so that's kind of the ground-based anti-satellite test series. The Russians have been working on developing a couple programs. The one that they tested just yesterday was, again, a ground-based interceptor. But what happened yesterday, there was no target that we're aware of as being flown at the same time. So essentially what it was a flight test of a rocket. And it was either, depending what we can tell, is maybe the 9th or 10th flight test. So obviously it's a system that they're working on and they're developing and looking at, but it's never been tested to actually shoot down a satellite, which is important because if you look at a lot of the press releases from the US military that came out about it, they said, okay, this is an anti-satellite weapon and it can shoot down satellites in low Earth orbit or LEO. The fact of the matter is Russia has never actually shot down a satellite from a ground-based launch. They like to do what it's called co-orbital, where they use something that's already up in space to attack. And so, I mean, they probably could, but this system has not proven it can. Russia actually has never proven that it can, whereas, US, China, and India have all done it within the past 10, 15 years or so. So that's, again, when we talk about the need to contextualize these sort of things, yes, it's disconcerting that they're working on this sort of anti-satellite program. And yes, you want to keep an eye on it. And yes, it's something you should talk about if you want to say, okay, what is a norm of behavior? What do we want a responsible space actor to be doing? Obviously, anti-satellite tests are not part of that. But you also need to recognize what other countries are able to do and what is the domain environment in which it's happening.
I noticed that in the media reporting, there was, it actually took like a good while for me to find anyone who actually said, oh, they didn't hit anything. And it was interesting that the reporting just kind of skimmed over that point. And it makes it sound a lot more threatening when you say Russia tested an anti-satellite weapon than Russia did a flight test on a rocket that could potentially be used for anti-satellite purposes, but there was no target. It's a different kind of thing.
Right, and this goes back to the idea about classification. The only reason why we know that they probably did not intercept anything, it's not because any kind of official source came out and said, okay, there wasn't actually a satellite that they were launched, they had no target they're working towards. Amateurs, people who were interested in this issue did the analysis and said, okay, based on what we know that was overhead at that point and the sort of altitudes it would have been, and based on notices that the Russians put out, they put out notice to mariners, things like, keep out of this area, keep out of this flight path, that sort of thing. They were able to do the analysis and figure it out. This was not any kind of government source or any kind of official designation, which again talks about the need to, have an open, transparent process to discuss these sort of issues.
Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think the other interesting thing is Victoria mentioned, this is the 9th or 10th one of these flight tests that we've seen for this system. And, probably nobody knows there's been that test of time. Now, so what was the different this time? What was different this time was the 4-star general, who's the head of Air Force Space Command and the commander of the Space Force, went public and said they did this. And that sort of made it a big news story. And so, that's sort of what's interesting here, is now starting with this, the U.S. military is now talking about this more and being more, at least a little bit more open about it. And I think that links up a little bit with what Victoria was saying earlier about how they have been talking about the need to talk more about these and have them less classified. But I think there's also, we got to be careful that there's also a little bit of self-serving nature here. Because we have a budget discussion going on in the U.S. about what's the budget for next year going to be, and there's still people questioning whether or not the Space Force is going to be worth it. And so, there is a bit of a narrative that, well, this test proves that the Space Force was necessary, or that the Space Force is doing what it's supposed to be doing, which we don't know that yet, right? Because it just happened, hasn't actually done anything yet. So we also got to be careful about that, while also keeping in mind, as you pointed out, the context that this is more of a flight test of a rocket than destroying a satellite.
Look, I'm conscious that it's very late where you are, and I've taken a lot of your time talking about things that I think are really interesting. So as a last kind of thing, is there anything that you'd recommend that people go and read outside of obviously the Counterspace report, which I will link to in the description? Read or watch or engage with, or anything they should do over the next couple of weeks while they're stuck inside?
Well, I would recommend the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS. They're a think tank in DC, and they actually we put out an excellent Counterspace threat assessment as well. They're good friends of ours, and I think it's very complementary to the report that we put out. So I'd recommend people look at that to kind of get a slightly different look, but also a very expert look at Counterspace capabilities globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And my recommendation would be a little bit different of a report. It's called The Physics of Space Security. And it's a report put out, probably 10, 15 years ago now, maybe even further, by an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists. And what's so good about it is it lays out the basic underlying physics of counterspace capabilities and satellite weapons, how all this stuff works, and what's feasible and what's not feasible. And I always recommend that, as it's a really good kind of a entry-level baseline to the technology and just sort of why space as a domain is a different area of operations than what we may be thinking of with, air or maritime operations.
They sound fantastic. I will link to both of those recommendations in the description under this video, or if you're listening in podcast form, they'll be in the description. And if you would like to ask any further questions, get in contact with me, and I can attempt to find you answers as well. Thank you so much, Brian and Victoria. It's been really wonderful talking to you.
Thank you, Annie. This has been great. Appreciate it.
That was my pleasure. Thank you.